Great. Thanks so much as well for everybody joining. Rob, it's great to finally meet you. You know, I have read you. I have like the diaries right here. I'm waiting for the Way Out, the latest novel that you translated by Ricardo Piglia. And you know, any friend, and particularly translator of Piglia, is a friend of mine. So it's really nice
Yeah,
to be.
yeah. I can. As soon as honestly, as soon as I read the epigraphs in your latest novel, I knew we could be friends. It was like someone on the same page, and a lot of the same ideas. Really enjoyed this novel, and I'm extremely excited not only to talk about it, but to see what you continue to write afterwards.
Yeah, I think like it might be a good idea to like explain to the people that are listening why it's the relationship Ricardo Piglia,
Definitely.
Carlos Fonseca, right? And just a very easy way to like even begin explaining like what Ricardo Piglia means for me is that this novel is dedicated to Ricardo Piglia. So you know you can already see like the amount of proximity, and it's dedicated to Ricardo Piglia for a particular reason, right? He was Ricardo Piglia was the type of author I think that changes how you read and therefore changes how you write. And when I arrived to Princeton, where I studied with him, I came in like kind of like with a kind of Faulknerian notion of what literature meant, and writing kind of like imitations of Faulkner. And by the time I left, I was doing something completely different. And
Yeah,
that's the
that's
type
amazing.
of person that Ricardo Piglia is. Like he changes how we read, and therefore he changes how we approach literature more broadly. And yeah, eventually when I wrote the first novel, which Restless Books published in 2016, Colonel Lágrimas, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do with it, right? It was just like the first piece of writing I had ever done. And I presented it to him, and he was the one who got me, who first read me, who like motivated me, and who like eventually said, this my interest, an editor, and not only any editor, but his editor, right? So this generosity that Ricardo Piglia had was, impressive. And he helped so many young authors in Argentina and abroad. So many people have similar stories as of mine. And so many people have taken him as a sort of kind of guru or type of like, influence or kind of like literary father figure. So I'm so happy that Restless Book now is recuperating him. And Rob, I thank you for like translating him.
Yeah, it's been
and doing such a good job at it.
thank you so much. It's been an enormous project in some ways, and I kind of feel like he's taken over my brain at times.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly rewarding just to kind of even spend that amount of time in someone else's head, all through his diaries. And actually, kind of along the lines of what you were saying in terms of how he taught you another way of reading. There's a great episode in the first volume of the Diaries of Emilio Renzi where he talks about kind of sitting on a stoop holding a book upside down before he knows how to read. Yeah. And then this figure, sort of imposing figure, stands over him and just flips the book upside down. And he says that man might as well have been Borges, because that's sort of the effect that his writing had on Piglia's own reading trajectory, and kind of showing him that the book was upside down, showing him this kind of entirely new way of looking at it. And I think that in many ways he wanted to sort of participate in that same tradition, and that's how he kind of interacted with you and other writers after him, in terms of showing a new way of reading. And I think you're definitely participating in that in the same way in your own work. The book is kind of full of all these hints and clues of sort of how it could be read, that I think it sort of produces a more critical reader in some ways.
Yeah, I love that you bring into play this beautiful anecdote that Piglia brings at the very beginning of the first volume of the diaries, because it showcases exactly what you're saying, that like Piglia is somebody who is coming from a very peculiar tradition, which is the tradition of the great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, right? And Borges's great move or great literary strategy was to say, more than the writer, the interesting figure is the reader.
Mm.
And by turning kind of the camera into the reader, he like completely changed Latin American literature, and that has made Latin American literature like as somehow strange but as rich as it is, right? This tradition like focused on the reader. And Ricardo Piglia, we must say, was somebody who was able to kind of manage at the same time two different careers, right? Which are often opposed, which are academia, right? He was a university professor, and on the other hand, he was a writer, and he wrote essays and he wrote novels, he wrote criticism and he wrote fiction, and he was able to kind of like mix them in a very kind of innovative fashion that was kind of unheard of, or still like is sometimes when people I think read in the English market world like the works of Piglia, they're like, this is something different. So Rob, I wanted to like perhaps like hear from your side, how did you get to like know about Ricardo Piglia? What was your first encounter with him, and how did that basically experience like translating to the
it's kind of it's an interesting story. So I first started translation in college, and it was kind of because I had studied Cortázar's writing, and from Cortázar I learned that a great way to become better at writing was to translate. You know, he's very well known for translating like the complete prose of Poe and things like that. And so I designed a course that was, you know, sort of overambitious. It was to translate a story from Spanish into English one week, and then a story from English to Spanish the next week, just alternating throughout the semester. And it was kind of you know, a really, really strange wide array, you know, from trying to think, Flannery O'Connor to Garcia Marquez, you know, just all sorts of kind of a strange trajectory. And then I followed that and ended up kind of returning to Cortázar to do a thesis, and I translated a book of his short stories. And after that, my advisor, Elon Stavins, you know, we had some serious conversations about translation, and he sort of introduced me to Piglia as a result of that, with the diaries, actually. So it was kind of a, you know, not certainly not the same trajectory and place to start that his readers in Latin America would have had. And I was just kind of, you know, initially it was a very daunting project, partly because to start with his diaries, you know, it doesn't operate in the same way as you know, almost any fiction you would have come across. It's very sort of it's built out of often incredibly opaque, you know, sort of partial ideas, because it's written in the form of these entries that are sort of for himself. And as he, you know, makes note of in the diaries, it's kind of a separate set of experiences from what he would actually remember. You know, the material recorded in the diaries is completely separate from the kind of the memories that really stick in his brain. And you know, as I kind of started to read that, the first volume of the diaries, I just kind of had never encountered anything like it. And I think kind of in the same mentality that had led me to, you know, try kind of translating all these great short stories. I wanted to, you know, kind of take on as much of a challenge from a translating perspective as I could. And it really, you know, it's kind of infinite. Like I could easily see returning to, you know, kind of re-edit and recompile the diary, you know, and retranslate in the future, just to, you know, because I think my understanding and relationship with it is, you know, still evolving in a lot of ways.
In the case of Piglia, it's interesting because, right, one tends to think, right, of diaries as something secondary. It's like, you know, like we have like the works, we have the novels, and then we have like the diaries as somebody for like real fans. But in the case of Piglia, it was interesting because he used to say while he was leaving, he's like, well, I just published the novels in order to get my editor one day to publish what is really worth it, which are my diaries, right?
Exactly. It's an amazing
and his editor in Spanish, Jorge Rale, used to say, well, like, you know, we all thought that it was a joke, that like, you know, it was just like, kind of like making a joke out of all of us. But when towards the very end of his career, he sat down to take this, I don't remember, it's 237
Mhm.
cuadernos, 237 notebooks that he had compiled during his life, it became clear that this was actually some of his best work was
Mhm.
there. And for reasons that had to do with what was Piglia's project as a whole, right? Piglia was somebody who, kind of working in the avant-garde tradition, was trying to mix life and literature, right? And what you get in the diaries is almost like the highest example of what it would mean to live life artistically, to the point in which you fictionalize life. You see life as a construct that is written, right?
Absolutely.
And what we all like loved was his decision to like publish the diaries, not as the diaries of Ricardo Piglia,
Mhm.
right? Not as, like John Cheever, I have right here, the journals of John Cheever, it's the journals of John Cheever. No, in this case, it's the diaries of Emilio Renzi,
Yeah.
right? And Emilio Renzi. So perhaps talk a little bit, it
Yeah.
would be interesting for us to talk a little bit about that and about Emilio Renzi as
Mhm.
a character.
Yeah. So Emilio Renzi is kind of um, this alter ego character that appears throughout his fiction. Starting with his very first collection of short stories, and through The Way Out, which is his last novel. So it's really very present. And actually, he basically took that name from his own name. His full name was both names sort of combined, and then he extracted Emilio Renzi for his alter ego and Ricardo Piglia for his sort of real author name. But Emilio Renzi is very closely related to his own obsession with kind of detective fiction, and so he's kind of taking a version of himself. There are a lot of elements like in The Way Out. Emilio Renzi is a sort of retiring literature professor, much like himself, but then kind of incorporating these elements of detective fiction and sort of framing the reader as kind of like an investigator of the text, and it's changing kind of your orientation toward the work. I think it leads you, especially in the diaries, framing it in that way, and immediately activates the text in a completely different way, both a completely different way from fiction and from diary. Traditionally, kind of as you were saying, it really, it for one thing, it kind of destabilizes the surface. It makes it very unclear what is invented and what is real at any moment. Which I think is something that you're experimenting with, definitely in a totally original way, in natural histories as well. I don't know if you could talk about maybe how if you had kind of discussions with him about that sort of approach to the text.
Yeah, I think something that you mentioned at the beginning now that is crucial is you mentioned that he was interested in the detective fiction, kind of like detective like plot. And some of our viewers might be thinking, well, like before you mentioned Borges, which is very kind of like high kind of literary forms, and now you're bringing into play detective fiction, which we tend to think of as some subgenre that is not as high art as. And one of the like interesting things that like Piglia showed us is that like we could adopt multiple traditions. Particularly in his case, he would say that you could adopt particularly two traditions. So he came from kind of this conceptual avant-garde tradition of fiction, which for him was highly represented in the works of Jorge Luis Borges or the works of, you mentioned before, Julio Cortázar or even Macedonio Fernandez, a very interesting avant-garde writer who Borges took to be his kind of like higher influence. But on the other hand, he had his love for the detective fiction, right? And that strategy of like saying, instead of just like having to fit neatly within one tradition, I can adopt many traditions, was something that opened for us like many different doors, not only to us, but like to like kind of writers that were writing at the same time as Piglia, like somebody like Roberto Bolaño, who is a writer very close to Piglia in the sense that he says, well, I come on the one hand from Jorge Luis Borges, from George Perec, from the avant-garde tradition, but I also come from the side of the beats, right? So I'm going to mix both.
Absolutely.
That kind of like strategy of like mixing two traditions to form something new, I think is something that is present, for example, in natural history. This idea that like you can like mix different kind of narrative strategies coming from different sides was something that was taught me a lot. And when I sat down in natural history, which is a novel that is indirectly about camouflage, about the idea of animal mimicry, the idea of adopting as one's identity the identity of another person, I said it might be interesting to like make each of the different sections based upon the style of other authors, in the same sense that like Piglia had taught us that in one way or another we could like find our voices through other people. So yeah, I think he was just so, decisive for like how we approach literature as a whole, that I could just continue to like see like different ways in which he like, or him or his influence is spread through the text. Another one in which like I would say that he was definitive or like fundamental for how I view literature is the type of characters that interest me. I think they're Piglian characters in ways that lead us again to like the latest novel of his that you have translated, which is A Way Out, El Camino de Ida in Spanish. These are characters that are usually eccentrics.
Yes.
Piglia was always interested in the eccentrics. He thought that like somehow the eccentrics had like a particularly kind of preferential or like particularly valid way of looking at the world. That led us perhaps to understand where he was politically coming from, right? So perhaps, yeah, like how do you see these like eccentrics and these like weird characters that appear in his fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like there's a great example of that in The Way Out. There's this, it's sort of set in a fictional version of Princeton, New Jersey. He calls it Taylor University, and but otherwise, you could basically draw a map, from descriptions in the book, placing it in Princeton. And there's one of the kind of most important characters in that setting is a character named Orion, who is sort of a man on the street with a cardboard sign, moving from place to place. But he acts, he kind of takes on this classical quality. And I think a lot of these kind of eccentric characters, they speak in sort of I think the description that came up in your novel is like she spoke in an epigrammatic style, kind of. It's these characters that sort of there's kind of like a performance of wisdom happening. But somewhere there's actual wisdom contained inside the performance of wisdom. Trying to think. I think it's totally wrapped up in his kind of political worldview. He doesn't look down on these kind of characters. He looks directly at them, and in that way, he's not like centering another experience and looking at their experience. He's kind of creating a much more equal viewpoint that doesn't kind of it's not preferential. It's kind of egalitarian in some way.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting for us to like think of like where does Piglia, about the beginnings of Piglia, which is something that the diaries showcase. Particularly the last volume of the diaries, which is the fact that Piglia is writing under a very peculiar like historical and political context, right? Latin America undergoes like political dictatorships, right-wing dictatorships throughout the 1970s, under which writers like Piglia, left-wing writers like Piglia, who back in the day was a Maoist, suffer a lot of censorship and everything. And Piglia's amazing capacity is that he's able to get through censorship writing in 1979, publishing in 1980, a novel that is indirectly an allegory about that kind of political situation. But he does it in such like an elaborate and allegorical fashion. I'm talking about respiración artificial, artificial respiration, that he's able to get it through. And that marks the beginning of like almost like of Piglia. He had published some stuff before, but that's kind of like the big kind of first book that Piglia publishes, which is just amazing, right?
Yeah, it's really amazing. And I think that's also kind of, that the placement of that novel in the context of the rest of his work also dictates kind of like the chronology of the diaries, how it's divided into these 3 volumes, because the 3rd volume, so I could kind of give a general sense of how the form works.
Yeah.
The 1st volume, it begins with his first diaries, which I think he started writing actually when he was 16. So they kind of, that's why he had these 327 notebooks. It just really this massive bulk of work spanning his whole life. And the first, so the first volume kind of goes from like late 50s to late 60s. The 2nd volume, and it's called Formative Years. It's sort of how he begins to approach writing. The second volume is kind of the next almost 10 years after that, and the 3rd volume begins kind of late 70s through early 80s, and that is exactly when he's writing. He's finally completing that novel, and it's interesting. You get such a in what comes through in the diaries is such a kind of like narrow image of the novel. You kind of get the sense that the political ramifications of it, he's afraid of even expressing in the diaries, because it's permeated, the political darkness has permeated his life to such an extent. And then he actually sort of omits at that point. He doesn't continue writing through kind of the real sort of bulk of his literary life in a lot of ways, when he was kind of most productive. And in some way the project is kind of like approaching that political statement, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was reading, it was like during this whole pandemic, like at the very beginning while we were in lockdown, I didn't have the attention span to like read kind of like normal books. And somehow the only thing that I could read was diaries. So I began reading like the journals of John Cheever, then some Gombrowicz, some Kafka, just like it was like, jumping from days to days.
Yeah.
And of course I ended up returning to like Piglia's diaries.
Yeah.
And they're fascinating because they're, in a way, as you say, they're the trajectory of what it means to become an author. And particularly in this case, what it meant for him, for whom, a writer who like kind of like puts the figure of the author and the reader at the very center of his work, what it meant for him to become an author, right? Under these peculiar political trajectories. And it was fascinating. And for me, it's also very fascinating. I was telling you at the very beginning, the trajectory that Piglia has had in the United States, because Artificial Respiration was published, I think, by Duke University Press under a translation, very good translation of Sergio Weisman. Then I think another one of his crucial novels called La Ciudad Ausente, The Absent City, was, I think, also translated by Duke University Press. But it was not until Ilan Stavans, the publisher of Restless Books, said, well, we need to really translate Piglia in the sense of like translating the whole body of his works and giving him a publishing house, that Piglia did not kind of become like a crucial kind of author as he is in the Spanish speaking world. So first of all, like, thank you for taking that job. And it's interesting. So do you guys you have done the diaries and you have done The Way Out. Are there plans of doing perhaps the essays?
I would really love to tackle the essays. I think, it's an enormous dimension of his work that, so far kind of the English readers have only kind of had a chance to really engage with his fiction in a lot of ways. And the diaries, which are sort of somewhere in the middle, but we don't have any concrete plans yet, but I'm definitely hoping to sort of undertake that. I'm kind of on a little bit of a break now. I just turned in a book by another author on Friday morning, actually. So I'm sort of I need a slight return to my brain.
Amazing. Which author is it?
It's Ebe Uhar.
Of course, yeah.
A collection of essays on animals, which is actually It's it
On
totally
animals.
totally
Ah,
wonderful.
so that's quite close to natural history.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
it'll be interesting. I was thinking about the essays because it'll be interesting once Piglia's essays and his novels as well get translated. It'll become much more evident where certain Latin American authors, where we are coming from, in the sense that like people sometimes take a novel like Natural History and tell me, this is strange because it's a novel, but it's kind of like essayistic as well. Or somebody takes a novel like Sudden Death by Alvaro Enrique and says, well, what am I confronted here with? Am I confronted with like, a historical novel, or am I confronted with like, an essay?
mhm.
Or somebody takes, a book by Valeria Luiselli or, certain authors. And it would be interesting once people read Piglia to understand that like that's the tradition where it's coming from.
Yeah,
Ricardo Piglia, an author that we could also like locate very close to, Enrique Villamatas, the Spanish
mhm.
author, who is also
Definitely.
working within that avant-garde tradition, within that like kind of, Piglia would not like me saying this word, but a meta-literary
Sure,
tradition,
yeah,
a
right, yeah.
tradition of literature about literature in a way.
Yeah. And in some ways, it almost feels like that tradition is more kind of in dialogue with a lot of like contemporary German writing. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, Alexander Kluge is one of my
Uh-huh.
favorite writers, and Sebald and these kind of people. Um,
Exactly.
you know, and actually, I think interesting. I think that's kind of that sort of writing is actually happening in the United States, but it's kind of authors like Claudia Rankine
Hmm.
and and people like that. I think are kind of participating more in that sort of tradition. Um, and so, yeah, I think definitely some of the essays could kind of provide that connection and have people sort of approach the book on its own terms. I think, yeah.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned the American tradition, it's interesting because Piglia was a very good reader of the American tradition, leading all the way back to like we see it in the diaries. He's reading Hemingway. He was a huge fan of Faulkner. He was reading Fitzgerald, right? And then when he begins to like you develop a theory of the novel, his references would be Philip K. Dick. He would mention Don DeLillo, right?
Mhm.
This postmodernist. Pynchon, he would be somebody that I would like locate in the kind of similar wavelength as like some of the novels of like Siri Husved. So it would be like that sort of writer, like
Yeah.
within what he called very smartly, he called paranoid fiction.
Yeah.
He
Exactly.
would say like, in my novels, everybody seems to like, we live, basically he located like the Lilo, that we live in a world that like has so much information and everything seems to be like always under CCTV cameras. So like there seem to be conspiracies everywhere, right?
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
type of world is the world of Pig, and I think that nowadays we clearly live in that world.
Absolutely. I think you can in your first novel, Colonel Lágrimas, I think there is kind of a sense of that, even just kind of the way the narration works at the very beginning, it's this like the we is the voice, and
Yeah.
it's very unclear the kind of like surface, like what, how we are looking at this character, um, what the relationship is. It's kind of, it's not, it doesn't begin from a stable point, it has a kind of paranoid quality, I think.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, I came to the narrative voice kind of like out of almost like by mistake, by like a discovery. One day I sat down, I had had way too much coffee, and I just started writing, and that strange narrator, a plural we, like appeared, and I was like, where is this coming from? But then as I started thinking about it, I started to believe in what you say, right? It has something of a CCTV kind of camera about it.
Yeah.
It works in a peculiar kind of like enclosed setting, which is one day in the life of this like very strange, bizarre, eccentric mathematician turned historian, which is based upon like a real life figure, the mathematician Alexander Grothendieck, who had fascinating life. Basically, his parents like were Russians who had fought in the like October Revolution, moved to the Spanish Civil War. Eventually, like they were Jewish, they underwent the Holocaust, and he somehow became the greatest mathematician of the second part of the 20th century. Became politicized in Vietnam and everything. But the strange thing for me when I read about this fascinating life is that towards the end of his life, he had decided to become a hermit. He moved to the French Pyrenees and just stayed there,
Yeah.
not seeing everybody. So returning to what we had said regarding the eccentrics that fascinated Piglia.
Yeah.
I think that I'm working a little bit in that tradition, and in natural history as well. I think that like each natural history has to do with the story of a family. It's a father, a mother, and a daughter that in 1978 decide to do a trip within the Latin American jungle, searching for a sort of anarchist commune, trying to like find some sort of like inspiration there. But when they reach the very end of the trip, instead of finding what they were looking for, they find something else, and each one of them takes a different kind of route. And each one becomes a sort of like hermit or a sort of eccentric in their different ways.
Obsession is everywhere.
Yeah.
Actually, I was curious. I wanted to ask if about your own relationship to obsession. Just, so somewhere behind the book, it just it's so kind of fascinating the way these repeating symbols lead people on these kind of mental spirals.
Yeah, I think in a way, obsession is at the very heart of the genre of the novel, right? Like even already from the figure of Don Quixote, is first of all a reader.
It begins with obsession. Totally.
An obsession, right? Then we would have somebody like, the classical obsessive, which would be Captain Ahab of Moby Dick, right?
Totally, yeah.
And in a way, I feel like the novelist always has to be obsessed because he always has a big white whale that is the novel that he's writing, right? And getting to the end is like a bit like following like Moby Dick or following the white whale, right? So I think even already within the genre of the novel, another example that I would give would be from my favorite books ever would be Faulkner's Absalom, like where Colonel Sodpen is an obsessive, right? He wants to like build a great like empire for himself, and eventually he's like defeated. Bouvard and Pécuchet from Flaubert, they want to build an encyclopedia in a way similar to what the protagonist of Colonel Lágrimas is trying to do. So I think in a way the novel is a genre of fixed ideas and a genre of obsession. Mm-hmm. And within Piglia's characters, you do get like these sort of characters that get some fixed idea, start a crazy project that makes no sense for anybody except themselves, and kind of you encounter them at the very heart of these crazy projects, right? Which in the way out, in a way, it's about that sort of character, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of it's based directly on the Unabomber. The name has changed, but it actually uses fragments of the Unabomber's manifesto, and combines them with other texts in this really interesting way. But it is kind of like the Unabomber is a perfect example of that kind of figure, someone who kind of actually, it was interesting about if you look at the actual man Ted Kaczynski that the Unabomber originated as, sort of began in the kind of northeastern elite context in some ways, and then kind of goes away from that, and then takes on this hermit's lifestyle, and is able to view that previous culture from an outside perspective suddenly.
Yeah, I think like it has to do also like why the question would be why choose the Unabomber, why like focus on like that Kaczynski. And I think it has to do with going back to what we were talking at the beginning, like Piglia's also kind of underlying political project, which has to do like with, he was, for example, very interested in the history of anarchism. Mm-hmm. Because in a way, I think coming from that context of the politics of Argentina in the 1970s, what became the great enemy was the state. And under that tradition, instead of just adopting kind of the Peronist possibility, which was kind of the left in Argentina, but a very complex left, he adopted the anarchist tradition. So he was always interested in characters that in a way kind of like position themselves in an anarchist position against the state, right? And this is, of course, not saying that he was saying that he would become the Unabomber, nothing like that, but explain a little bit why his characters always seem to work in these kind of marginal positions with regards to the state.
Yeah, it's kind of just a rhetorical strategy, you
Mhm.
know, for how to not kind of just comply with a dominant narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I kind of want to, you know, switch tacks and ask a couple of questions about natural history. I have a couple. Um, I really want, because I really wanted to ask about how you conceptualize kind of your use of art history in the novel. Um, and one thing that kind of amazed me was that, you know, in some novels I've seen kind of a use of an artist or a painting at the beginning. It kind of creates this atmosphere that sort of it affects the tone for the rest of the book.
Mhm.
You know, but what you do is kind of is these fast juxtapositions. You have Diego Rivera and then Edward Hopper in the space of a couple of pages, and it's a totally different, you know, visual framework. And I'm curious about how you think of you know, the kind of the combined effect of all of those images
Yeah.
throughout the book.
Well, tying it into Piglia, I think there is an easy way, right? At the end of the day, like both Piglia and like as a consequence of his influence, myself, we see kind of the avant-garde moment of the arts as a kind of a genesis for what we're doing in from a literary perspective, right? So we see the 1910s and 1920s as a moment in which like art and literature like opened up themselves to like different kind of conceptual possibilities, right? Piglia has often mentioned that like what Borges kind of begins to develop with regards to the avant-garde tradition is the possibility of what he calls conceptual literature, literature of ideas,
Mhm.
just as Marcel Duchamp was doing conceptual art.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that the characters that one encounters in natural history are many of them like tied to that tradition of conceptual art, right? We encounter the very center of the novel a character that has been brought to trial because she claims to be performing something that she calls art, which is inserting. This novel was written before the current presidency, but she was inserting fake news into the media and calling that art in order to like disrupt the markets.
Mhm.
As you mentioned, also Edward Hopper plays a role at the beginning. And the question I think that you're asking is like, these are very different sort of projects. How are we going to tie them
Exactly.
in
That's
together?
amazing.
And I think the answer has to do with something that I was mentioning before, which is the novel is structured in five different, like, you know, parts,
Yeah.
almost like as if there were five different novels. Each one has a different style, and each one kind of like begins, however, to build kind of a metaphorical, at least I try to do it, build a metaphorical resonance through which certain metaphors begin to get repeated, right?
Mhm.
Hopper, we're working with isolation, night, insomnia. Insomnia can help us understand obsession. And I think that that's at least like how I often tend to work through books. I tend to like see not only causes and effects or like plot lines, but rather kind of like novels are like metaphorical resonance boxes. And like if we're able to tie in metaphors together or like images together, that's, you know, the
Mhm.
highest that like one could do. And I think the different artists that appear in this book in one way or another kind of like have to do with the broader kind of metaphors or
Mhm.
images that like the novels.
Yeah, that's something that I really admired was the way you could keep returning to these ideas and use this idea of repetition, but it never became, you know, it was always kind of just increasing the nuance and getting closer to the kind of idea that connected all these metaphors, you know, rather than just sort of a kind of reiteration.
Yeah, it was just kind of like, it's almost like the idea of variations, right?
Mhm.
Like one, which is something Borges would work through. It's the same theme, but like producing a variation, changing the setting. I mentioned before the natural history is a novel that is indirectly linked to camouflage and animal mimesis, right, or mimicry. Just as a chameleon changes color, and then it begins to explore that kind of metaphor in different levels, right? So just as the chameleon adopts its identity by, you know, imitating its surroundings, we could like approach that and like change it into like a fashion designer, right? That works with like clothing that at the end of the day, like has to do with our relationship with our environment.
Yeah.
And then it has political consequences, right? Because one of the things that appears towards the very end of the novel is this history of the camoufleurs, which were kind of avant-garde cubists that in the First World War were enlisted in the army in order to like use their strategies as painters in order to help with something crucial that was emerging in the First World War, which was camouflage, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have a
Camouflage
fantastic reference to Gertrude Stein and Picasso at the end, where Picasso recognizes in the camouflage like the creation of Cubism.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating anecdote where one of the first camouflage tanks is like kind of parading itself through Paris. And then Gertrude Stein is with Picasso, and Picasso, of course, in a very kind of narcissistic way, like looks at the tank and says, "Look, Gertrude, it's me. We invented this. This is a cubism, right?" So that relationship where you have art,
Mm-hmm.
politics, and nature was kind of the triangle that like I was interested in exploring.
Yeah, and also I think it really gets at the destructive qualities of all of those things specifically.
Yeah. Which now that I think about it, it's kind of the same triangle that Piglia is working out on the way out, because on the way out, of course, it's a novel, as all of Piglia's novels are, about art and literature. It's a novel about politics, but it's also a novel about a different political kind of like angle that had not emerged, or at least not as strongly in Piglia's work until that novel, which is nature, right? And what is happening to nature. He talks about hot sun, right? Some sort of light. So it would be kind of the same triangle in one way or another.
Absolutely.
Let me just jump in to say this is a fascinating discussion, and I'm riveted by all of these references, especially to Gertrude Stein and Picasso. And I'm thinking, oh, well, I've got a lot to think about now. Folks, if you have questions for Carlos and Robert, please post them in the chat. And one of the things that we like to ask our guests, and so this will give everybody a little breathing time here, is if you had a book or two that you might at the very end recommend, you can think about that now. You don't have to answer it now. We'll do that at the end, but I definitely want to put that out there, that if you wanted to recommend a book or two to our audience, something that you've read, or we certainly did put Absalom in there, Carlos, so don't worry, it's in there. Got to have our Faulkner, daily dose of Faulkner. But we'll definitely put that in the chat at the end.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I'll just pose a question, because for some strange reason, I love to think about dictatorships. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading a French translation into Spanish of a book entitled Las Mujeres de los Dictadores, mm-hmm. The Women of the Dictators. And it's a history of women who would write love letters and fan mail to real letters. This is an actual history to Mussolini and Hitler and all the great dictators, right? Great in air quotes. So I'm thinking about writing during dictatorship, like Piglia. Mm-hmm. And if the two of you could talk a little bit about what kind of effects you think producing literature under dictatorship produces.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I must say, I'm talking to Rob, a translator, and I must mention Natural History was translated by the great Megan McDowell, who has done a wonderful job with both of the novels, and she has translated amazing other authors that talking about recommendations, I would recommend, like Samantha Schweblin, Lina Meruane, this novel, Seeing Red, or Mariana Enriquez would be three of the authors that Megan has translated. And so, Patricia, going back to your question, I think it's very interesting what you say. Also regarding the gender perspective, I have often thought about it, because in Latin America, particularly not the generation of Piglia, but the generation before, the generation of Garcia Marquez, they all became obsessed with writing what they call la novela del dictador, the dictator novel. They each have one. So like all of the kind of male famous writers of the Latin American boom have one. Garcia Marquez has El Otoño del Patriarca, The Autumn of the Patriarch. Vargas Llosa has La Fiesta del Chivo, the goats party. I don't know how they translate it, something like that. And Carlos Fuentes has Gringo Viejo, and somebody else had something else. And the interesting here from the perspective of gender is that they all, as male authors, become obsessed with the figure of the dictator themselves, almost to the point in which you kind of like begin to sense that they are kind of like projecting this like almost like, you know, fetishistic fascination with the dictator. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's interesting to see what happens in a much more innovative fashion when you see about female authors who were writing under the same context. They're not so obsessed, like I'm thinking of an author like Luisa Valenzuela in Argentina, or Marta Traba in Uruguay, writing about the same context, but they become not so interested with the figure of power itself, kind of in this chauvinist, machista way, but rather kind of other ways in which power expresses itself. So just thinking about this, the women, I was reminded first of Garcia Marquez, who says that the autumn had given birth to the kids of everyone in town, and then kind of switching that around into other perspectives.
It was funny when you mentioned the book that you were reading. It reminded me immediately of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark, because Miss Jean Brodie is this kind of authoritarian teacher in some way, and then later in the novel it's revealed that she has like a photo of Mussolini in her room, and she kind of is very interested in this. It's kind of like the aesthetics of fascism, mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of a lot of what Carlos was talking about. Also, the way that it affects male writers. There can be this kind of like strange, perverse identification with those kind of figures. It actually reminds me also of Alexander Kluge, and this a book that I'd like to recommend is Cinema Stories. So kind of a little bit hard to find, but one of my favorite books. And he kind of he talks about the way that fascism uses aesthetics and kind of these figures. Like another place that crops up is the movie My Dinner with Andre, talking about the identification of fascism with The Little Prince. So I think that it's also fascism kind of knows how to mobilize aesthetics and get people to hone in on the image rather than the implications in a lot of ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. I was taking copious notes, so thank you both very much for that. I am looking through the chat, and I think we have a shy audience, or else you've answered all their questions. So I would, if you don't mind, I'd like to pose another one, if I may. When you're thinking about translating, Robert, and you're trying to find the voice in a translation, what challenges do you confront there? And then on the other side, Carlos, when you must give your book, your child, up to a translator, and you've created this, how do you recognize your narrative voice in the translation? So if the two of you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit.
It's a great question. I mean, I actually, it's one thing I'd like to mention is that I'm thinking about the voice a lot, but I'm thinking just as much about kind of the cultural implications and the context. that the book, the work that I'm translating originally appeared in, and that it's going to appear in, because I don't want to exoticize the text in any way, for example. And so I'm very concerned with trying to, maintain the original context rather than kind of just trying to insert, or approach from my own context. In terms of the voice, I mean, I've developed a kind of a strange technique. The way that I translate anything is that I take all of the original, I put it in a document, and then I break it up into kind of like 2 or 3 line chunks, and I work through it, deleting as I go for the first draft, so that I can't, so that I have to work in the same direction constantly. And then, and that first draft produces something that almost has none of the voice. It's fairly literal. And then I return and kind of create something that's almost too much in a voice. It's almost more in my voice, and I go through and I smooth it and make it sound right in my head, kind of just without thinking of how it pre-existed, kind of just looking at the text. And then the final round is when I start to I then compare that to the original and try to tease out kind of like the nuances of the voice. But I think it really comes down to very small details and nuances. It's kind of you sort of develop a sense, working through a long text for a large amount of time, you develop a sense of how kind of like prepositions and things are somehow unique, and then you kind of try to be faithful to that, or come up with a system that will achieve something similar.
Yeah, in my case, yeah, as you say, it's the writing is something precious, so it's always a question about like who do you hand it into. And I have been very lucky, basically. Megan McDowell, even before she translated Colonel Lágrimas, had translated many of my favorite authors from the generation that immediately precedes mine, authors like Alejandro Zambra, I mentioned before, Samantha Schweblin. So I knew that she would do a great job because I had read those books and I just completely like trusted her. And in my case, something that happens is usually that like when I finish writing, I have to hand in the novel in Spanish. But when I see it published, I always say, wow, like if I could still edit more.
Yeah.
So we usually take, the English edition as a possibility for like editing even more. Like, writing is never finished. It's never perfect. So why not like use like the translation as a way of editing? So that's something we did in Natural History, just kept the writing process going alongside like the great editor Julia Ringo and Megan, and we were all working and saying, well, there was this repetition here, we could like, so this is almost like a translation, but literally it's better in the sense that it has been like edited in a further fashion. Ilan Stavans also like provided great editing like help, so I need to like thank him. So yeah, we writing is never done. It's always like it's never finished. It's something that like translation can always improve in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And Rob, I think there is a question for you.
Right. Yes, Robert, the question for you is, are you doing any of your own writing? And if so, do you feel influences from Piglia or any of the authors you translated during the college course you designed, or not?
Yeah, I think I am doing some of my own writing. It's very all over the place. It's very early, and there are a lot of projects that I've kind of started and then stopped for kind of ideological reasons. Over time, it no longer feels right. The first time I ever considered writing a novel, I wanted to use the figure of Edward Bernays, kind of a little known American figure who I think is one of the worst people of all time. But then because of that, I realized that I didn't want it to be centered around this kind of like negative relationship with the figure. You know, I was kind of oriented the wrong way. I'd say absolutely. You know, part of the reason that I enjoy translation is because I learn just as much about English as Spanish when I'm doing it, in the course of kind of trying to figure out how something will work, or just, you know, just kind of conceptually, you know, how language works. I'd say the third volume of the diaries, which is coming out later this fall, has really been an enormous influence on me specifically. It's just the form of it is unbelievable. It kind of starts like the previous two volumes of the diaries, and it has a series of entries, but then it has a middle section called A Day in the Life, which is the title of the whole collection. And he really it's one of the best things I'd ever encountered. It really just, you know, he sort of conceptually reconstructs a day from these moments throughout the course of his diaries, and just it flows in, you know, an unbelievable way. And so I think something that I want to achieve in English is to learn the techniques of Spanish writing and come up with a, you know, some form of, you know, reproducing the effects of time and things like that work in Spanish that don't necessarily work in English.
Well, we are at the top of the hour. I can't believe, talk about the way that time just collapses, and it's very subjective. I can't believe the hour is over. So I want to give anyone else in the audience a chance to ask a question if they have one. And I wanted to also make sure, it looks like we, thanks to Stephanie for getting those book recommendations in there from Carlos and Robert. Any final thoughts in English or in Spanish from Robert and Carlos?
Read natural history.
And read Ricardo Piglia and Rob Kroll's translation. The diaries are amazing. The Way Out is amazing. The previous novels, both Respiración Artificial, Artificial Respiration, La Ciudad Ausente, Absent City, are magnificent. And we look forward to like Rob Kroll's Piglia influenced a novel.
Definitely we'll see the influence, yeah.
And thanks so much to Malaprop, Stephanie, Patricia for the invitation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. We got a comment from one of the members of the audience, Lynn, who says, please know that this was wonderful.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very nice. We always love an opportunity to celebrate and get a chance to spend time with authors and translators. So this was a particularly gratifying conversation to enjoy, the two of you. And we thank you both so much. And Carlos, we hope you come into Malaprop sometime. And Robert, we know you're planning to come on in. So we hope you can. Anybody who wants to purchase from Malaprops can do so online. We also do curbside delivery in Buncombe County. And you can also make a reservation by booking on malaprops.com if you live in Buncombe County. Thank you all so much, and we hope you have a wonderful remainder of your Labor Day weekend, and we wish you all the best and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.